Hello, hello. Today we're going to talk about some event propagation in JavaScript. I can't think of anything else you'd rather be doing right now than learning about event propagation in JavaScript. In JavaScript, we're able to register listeners to elements inside our document object model, or the DOM. When we add an event listener, we say what event we want to listen for. We pass in a function that we want to execute when the event is triggered, and then we pass in another variable called another parameter called our useCapture. UseCapture is going to determine when that function is going to fire when the event triggers. So if we look at some HTML, we have a basic table here, and we've registered some event listeners. So I have rows, cells, and some wrappers, and then I have my event listeners where I'm saying, okay, grab the title. Oh, well, let's go down and look at the ones where I'm adding to the row. I say, get me the element with ID Connor. I'm going to add an event listener called click. The function that I want to execute is action1, and I do not want it to use capture. So that is the default. False is the default for use capture, which means essentially that unless you explicitly say to use capture with true, it will not use capture and will fire on the reverse end. Before we jump into some examples here, I'm going to show you some visualizations. So this is a graphic I found on Stack Overflow where it shows a DOM. In this DOM, we've got a default view, and you can see kind of starting at the lowest level, or the root level of the document. We have a document view, the document, then we start with our HTML, our body, table, tbody. All of these are elements on which we can register event listeners. So when a user clicks on a page, what you're going to see is that the event of the click is going to start traveling down our DOM until it gets to the point, or all the points, that was clicked on. So in this case, if we click on the cell, it's going to go down all the way until it gets to the cell, and any events that use capture are going to pick that up. By default, we're only going to be dealing with the bubbling phase. So our events are only going to be those elements that are registered to respond to events that are triggered are only going to be picked up in the bubbling phase with the default setting, or false use capture. And so let's just see kind of what that would look like. So if I'm going down here, let me turn this one off. This is a visualization we'll look at in just a second, and we'll turn this one on. So this is the web page that we had, and if I click on, for example, Connor, which we identified, we're going to see action 1 is triggered. We hit OK, and then we can see action 2 is triggered, and its current target is the row. Action 3 then follows, the target being the table, the current target, and then the div is the current target of the fourth action. Note, though, that what I clicked on as a user was the TD. So the TD is my target of the click, but everything registered within that path that has an event listener registered to it is going to trigger. In this event, they are being triggered 1 through 4 based on bubbling. So they're all being found in this order where it goes, hey, there's an event here, and so the TD is going to fire. So that's our first event, because it's already traveled down in the capture phase, found nothing, and then it starts identifying what elements have event listeners registered to them. So we start with the TD, then we go to the TR, that's our action 2 that gets fired second. Then we go to our table, that was our action 3, and then we had a wrapper in here, and that was action 4. And so it's in figuring out what order events are going to fire in, you can use the DOM to identify that by looking at what they're using, whether you're using capture or bubbling, and in this case we're just using bubbling, and then following that tree back up. And that will be, as it goes from the most deeply nested child back up to the root, it'll be in that order from child to root. And if we wanted to switch that up and see what happens with the capture phase, and in that instance, I'll go into my document here, and I'm going to change all of these from not using capture to use capture. So we just change that false to true. I'm just going to highlight all of those and just change them all to true. So we can see they're all set to true. Now what we can expect is now, instead of processing those events on the bubble phase, we're going to be processing them as we go down into the DOM. So now we're going from root to child. So when we get to our wrapper, that's going to be our first one. So action 4 should fire first here. When we get to the table, action 3 should fire, being our second captured event, as we're going from root to child. Then we get to our row, we add action 2 in there, and then finally we get to our cell, and that's going to be action 4. So in that capture phase, we just grab things in the order that they come. And then we go back in the bubbling phase, there's nothing to fire, so nothing else is going to be added to our events that need to be handled. So if I come in here and I click on Connor again, now we see that action 4, the div, our wrapper, is being fired first, then action 3, the table, then action 2, the row, and then finally action 1 on the cell. So it's nice to be able to kind of see how those things fire. And what happens though if we decide that we're going to have some be true and some be false? And there are situations in which you'll have certain events that may be closer to the root in the DOM that we want to fire first. So we're going to have our row be set to true. We'll make the cell itself set to false, and then let's make the table here set to false. So if we have action 4 being our wrapper is set to true, and action 2 being the row set to use capture, if we look at our diagram here, we can just come down this table and say, okay, what's using capture? Well, we know the wrapper is, so the wrapper, since that's going to be the first one, that's going to be the first event that fires. As we keep going down, we'll run into the row, and that will be our second event that fires. Then we'll get to the TD, which is set to false, but since it's the last element that's handling an event in that history, that tree, that's going to then be our third item. Then we're going to start bubbling up. No, the row's already been captured, and then we do have the one that's on the table, so that's going to be last. So we'll see that we're alternating, we're changing how the DOM, how our page is going to handle these events, where we'll have the wrapper, then we'll have the row, then we'll have the cell, and then we'll have the table in those orders. And there's not much we can do beyond the capture and no capture to determine at which point in this phase are these events going to fire, trigger, and then our functions are going to be called in order to handle the triggering of those events. So now if I come back and I click on Connor this time, we expect our div to fire first. We say okay, then our row, which are both using capture, and now we're going to switch to the bubbling phase. That's where our cell gets fired, and then finally our table is fired. So we're able to change the order that these actions will fire based on whether or not they're using capture. Another thing that I did is I made a little a little page that can visualize. Let's bring that one live here. That will visualize kind of the order of these events and how they're firing. So I have some events that are registered on these objects in my DOM, on these elements, and I have one set on the div of samples, and we can see that from its hierarchy of the div, it's HTML body div, and it is not set to use capture. If I look at my paragraph, we can see, okay, we have HTML, body, div, and the paragraph. All of those are not set to use capture. Likewise, we have another one that's also a child of the div, where it's HTML body, div is false, and this one is true. And we have a more deeply nested div where we have both of them are true. And then finally, we have a span within one of our divs that is set to false. So if we're looking at this as an order of how things are going to fire, if I look at my capture phase, it's going to drive that down and look at which ones have true. And we can see that when I clicked on that, the div sample, that first one here, that's set to true, so that's going to be the first event that's going to fire. Second is going to be our nested div 1, also set to true, so that's going to be our second event that gets fired. When we look at the bubble phase, we're going to fire 2 more. Now the span, since that's the first one as that bus is coming back up our DOM, the span is false, so it's going to capture that one next, and we're going, or bubble it, and that one's going to be the third event to fire in this case. And then finally, it's going to get back to that div up here, and that's going to be the fourth one that gets fired. If we look at something like the paragraph, that one, where both of these are false, if we look at our capture phase, it's going to drive down there, our bus goes down, and nothing is picked up because nothing is set to true. So it gets through the capture phase without finding any events, and when we go to our bubble phase, it comes back up the tree, and we fire the paragraph first because that's the lowest one. That's the latest one that has any events registered to it. So that's going to fire. And then it finds that div that also has false, and it's then able to capture that one as well. So it's event capture and event handling, the propagation of these events. It can seem a little convoluted at times when you're first looking at it and figuring out, well, why on earth is my button not firing how I think it should be firing? These other events are firing first. And a lot of that is determined exactly by where it stands in the DOM. So if we're looking at our event and we're having events that aren't responding how we think they are, we can graph out exactly where things are going to fire. And based on whether or not capture is set to true, if it's set to true, we can anticipate exactly the order that those things are going to fire in and build a list ourselves of what we see and how we think that's going to fire. Then we look at the ones that are set to false, and we watch how those happen within the bubbling phase. So again, looking at this, if I come back down to my span, and I've got 2 set to true and 2 set to false, we look at that capture phase, the bus travels down our DOM until it gets to the span, and it only fires the ones, it only puts the 2 divs that have true on their use capture into the order, in the order that they are found as it goes down the DOM. In the bubble phase, it goes back up the DOM, and it adds all the ones that are false at this point that it hasn't captured yet, and we add those in the order that they're found going back up the DOM. So those are some helpful ways of looking at events and event propagation and how we can anticipate the order that our events will fire when we're binding events to elements with JavaScript. The other nice thing is that it's not just about anticipating as if the web page itself will change the order depending on its mood that day. The nice thing is that we now have enough information that we can start to control when we want those events to fire. So thanks so much for joining me and learning about event propagation, and have a wonderful time in JavaScript land.